Ever get the feeling that, like, most political commentary these days just feels overly rehearsed? Like, everyone's kind of playing it safe, you know?
Absolutely. It's all about staying on message,
Yeah.
even if that message gets lost a little bit in translation.
Exactly. Well, today's deep dive, we are ditching the script, going completely off-road with this guy named Chris Abraham.
Yeah.
You send over these excerpts from AI-powered interview, and let me tell you, Chris is about as unfiltered as they come.
Yeah, what's so fascinating about Chris is that he really doesn't fit neatly into any one political box.
No.
He's got this really unique blend of opinions, some might even say contradictions, that make him a really compelling case study
It's true.
for us to dig into.
Yeah, it's like he took all the hot-button issues, immigration, climate change, healthcare, tossed them in a blender, just hit pulse. We're talking open borders, but with a strong emphasis on local control. Skepticism about climate change, yet a firm belief in personal responsibility.
I know.
It's a wild ride, and we're going to unpack it all, starting with what sparked Chris's decision to even do this interview in the first place.
Right.
The upcoming Harris-Trump debate.
Right, which is especially interesting because this is an AI-generated interview, meaning in our reality that debate never happened.
Right.
Yet Chris speaks about it as if it's this major cultural event in also Clash of the Titans.
Yeah, he seems oddly captivated by both Harris and Trump, but for totally different reasons.
Yeah.
He calls Trump this, like, force of nature, someone who operates outside the usual political playbook. But then he also expresses admiration for Harris, pointing out the historical significance of potentially having a woman of her background in the Oval Office.
Yeah. It's almost as if he sees both of them as disruptors in their own right,
Yeah,
each challenging the status quo, albeit in vastly different ways.
totally. And this tension between tradition and disruption, it pops up throughout the entire interview,
Yeah.
especially when Chris dives into his views on immigration. He comes out swinging, advocating for completely open borders, no restrictions, no quotas, just a global welcome mat to the United States. What did you make of that?
Well, his reasoning is where things get a little bit nuanced. He frames it not just as a humanitarian issue, but a consequence of America's global actions. He argues that after decades of interventionism, open borders are a form of reparation, a way to offer refuge and opportunity.
Okay, so a sense of responsibility on the world stage. But then he brings it back home, arguing that open borders could help address labor shortages and revitalize communities. He even uses his own apartment building as an example, mentioning it's now primarily occupied by immigrants from Afghanistan and Syria. It's like he's acknowledging that immigration isn't some abstract concept, it has a real impact on communities, on individuals.
Absolutely, and that's where we start to see the potential friction between his stance on open borders and his equally strong belief in local control. He's a big proponent of states' rights, even down to the community level.
It's really interesting. So he's basically saying, sure, come on in, but don't expect things to be the same everywhere. He uses the example of how differently, say, public indecency laws might be enforced in different parts of the country. You could get away with a lot more in certain parts of California than you could in, say, a small town in Alabama.
Exactly, and this is where things get really interesting. How do you reconcile a belief in open borders, this idea of a global community, with the very real differences that exist within America itself?
Right, like he wants to have his cake and eat it too.
Mm.
And this seeming contradiction, it plays out in his views on climate change as well. Because on the one hand, you've got Chris calling climate change a hustle, a way for governments to increase control and line their pockets. But on the other hand,
He's deeply suspicious of big government programs and what he sees as wasteful spending. He links the Biden administration's climate initiatives to the economy, arguing that the focus on green energy is actually hurting everyday Americans.
so is it really about climate denial? Or is it more about, like, a deep distrust of centralized power, particularly when it comes to economic policy? What do you think? Is there a way to disentangle those two threads?
It's a question worth pondering, especially as we delve deeper into Chris's views on healthcare, because here's someone who actually supports universal healthcare, which on the surface seems at odds with his aversion to big government.
Right. It's like he's trying to find that sweet spot, right, between ensuring everyone has access to essential care while also, like, reining in costs and avoiding what he sees as government overreach.
And this balancing act gets even more complicated when he starts talking about what he doesn't think should be covered under universal health care.
Okay.
We're talking elective procedures, things like cosmetic surgery. He even draws a line in the sand when it comes to abortion.
Yeah. He freely admits to being personally, morally opposed to abortion, but then goes on to say that he believes women should have complete autonomy over their bodies.
It's a fascinating example of how personal beliefs can sometimes clash with policy decisions. It makes me wonder, how do you, as our listener, navigate those gray areas? Do your own moral convictions ever come into conflict with what you think should be legally accessible? Let us know your thoughts after this deep dive.
Yeah, it's a tightrope walk, isn't it? Trying to balance those personal beliefs with policies that impact, an entire society. And Chris's views on abortion, prime example of how tricky that can get. But hold on tight, because we're about to venture even further into this labyrinth of Chris's political compass as we cackle his stance on LGBTQ rights.
This is where Chris's background, particularly his upbringing in Hawaii, kind of adds another layer of complexity.
Yeah, how so?
Well, he talks about this concept of mahu, a third gender identity that he says was completely normalized in Hawaiian culture. He even draws a parallel to cyberpunk literature with its themes of body modification and self-expression.
Interesting. So we're seeing those early exposures to different cultural norms. It definitely seems to have shaped his views on gender identity. But then he throws us a curveball.
Right. He goes on to express concerns about children transitioning genders,
Okay.
arguing that it should be left up to the parents, not the state. It's almost as if he draws a clear line between, adults and minors. Adults, in his view, should have the freedom to express themselves however they choose. But when it comes to children, he believes those decisions should stay within the family unit.
Okay, so we've got that tension again between individual freedom and what he perceives as government overreach.
Right.
And this theme of personal responsibility versus government intervention. It
Yeah.
really comes to the forefront when he starts talking about education.
Yeah, he makes a clear distinction between vocational schools and traditional colleges. He's all for free and open access when it comes to learning a trade, arguing that everyone should have, the opportunity to develop practical skills. But when it comes to higher education, he's got a different perspective.
So it's like he's saying, look, if you want to be a plumber, an electrician, we'll give you the tools to succeed without, burdening you with debt. But if you're aiming for that fancy liberal arts degree, you better be ready to work for it and pay for it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He sees it as a matter of individual initiative and, frankly, a bit of a reality check,
Yeah.
He's worried that by making college too accessible, we're devaluing the importance of hard work and personal achievement. It all ties back to his fear of what he sees as economic mismanagement by the government. He's really concerned about taxes, especially on businesses, arguing that if you squeeze them too hard, they'll just pack up and move elsewhere.
He uses the exodus of companies from California to Texas as his exhibit A, right?
Yeah.
It's like he's saying, see, this is what happens when you try to create a utopia through government intervention.
Yeah.
You end up driving away the very people who create jobs, who generate wealth.
It's a perspective that resonates with a lot of people, especially those who feel overtaxed and underserved by the government, They see these successful entrepreneurs and business owners not as villains, but as engines of economic growth.
Right. And this brings us back to Chris's deep distrust of centralized power. Whether it's climate change initiatives, healthcare reform, or education policy, he seems to view government involvement with a healthy dose of skepticism.
It's not necessarily that he's against these things in principle,
Right.
but he's wary of unintended consequences. He worries about government overreach, bureaucratic bloat, and the potential for these programs to become more about control than about actually helping people.
So are we sensing a pattern here? Because whether you agree with him or not, you got to admit, there's a certain consistency to Chris's worldview. He seems to value personal freedom, individual responsibility, and a healthy dose of skepticism towards authority.
Absolutely. And those values, whether you share them or not, offer a lens through which we can start to make sense of his often contradictory and always fascinating political compass.
It's like we're piecing together a puzzle, one seemingly paradoxical viewpoint at a time. But before we try to solve the enigma that is Chris Abraham, we've got one more stop to make on our deep dive, and this one might be the most revealing yet.
You're talking about his views on gun control, aren't you? Buckle up, listeners, because this is where Chris's belief in self-reliance and personal liberty really takes center stage.
No kidding. When it comes to the Second Amendment, Chris doesn't just stand his ground. He builds a fortress around it, complete with guard towers and a moat filled with, well, you can probably guess.
Yeah, let's just say he's a firm believer in the right to bear arms, and I'm not just talking about hunting rifles here.
Right.
Chris advocates for unrestricted access to firearms, including handguns, semi-automatic rifles, the works.
He even draws a parallel between gun ownership and personal safety.
Right.
arguing that, both citizens and law enforcement should have the means to defend themselves. He even recounts a story about confronting someone trying to break into his home, making it clear that he's not afraid to use lethal force if necessary.
It's a stark reminder that for Chris, personal safety isn't just some theoretical concept.
Yeah.
It's a lived reality.
Right.
And it speaks to his deeply held belief in self-reliance, a value that seems to underpin so many of his views. It's almost as if he sees the world as this, unpredictable place where you can't always rely on others, particularly the government, to protect you.
So where does this leave us? We've explored Chris's unconventional views on everything from immigration and climate change to healthcare and gun control. We've seen how his beliefs often defy easy categorization, how he seems to embrace contradictions as readily as he challenges conventional wisdom. What's the takeaway here for you?
I think for me, it really highlights the importance of engaging with viewpoints that make us uncomfortable,
Yeah.
Especially if we don't agree with them.
Yeah.
Chris's willingness to just put it all out there, to voice his unfiltered opinions, even if it ruffles feathers or challenges our own assumptions, I think that's something we could all learn from.
Absolutely. It's like he says at the end of the interview, I really hope I don't regret sharing my true opinion with the world. There's a vulnerability there, a recognition that putting yourself out there, expressing dissenting views, it comes with a certain level of risk.
And that risk, that vulnerability, it's become even more pronounced in our age of social media, right?
Oh, yeah.
Where one offhand comment can lead to like a firestorm of criticism or even, real world consequences. It makes you wonder, are we losing the ability to have difficult conversations, to grapple with complex issues without resorting to outrage or personal attacks?
It's a question worth pondering, and one that Chris's interview has certainly brought to the forefront. So to our listener, we leave you with this. In a world that often feels increasingly polarized, how do we create space for honest, open dialogue about controversial issues? How do we engage with those different perspectives, even those that challenge our own, in a way that is both respectful and productive?
It's a tall order. But as Chris has shown us, sometimes the most insightful conversations, they emerge from the most unexpected places.
That's true.
So keep asking those tough questions, keep listening with an open mind, and most importantly, keep diving deep.
Love it.